We'll bring that to you as soon as we can. But this is a continuation of a trend that we've been seeing for the last 24 hours now. So last night here in Babda in Beirut, which is a Christian area, a hotel was targeted by an airstrike. And a couple of hours earlier, the same evening, an apartment building in the village of Aramoun, which is not that far from here in Mount Lebanon, it's a traditionally Sunni and Druze village, was also the subject of an Israeli airstrike. And so we're seeing a territorial and sectarian expansion of the places that are being targeted. And what that risks, of course, is resentment and community tensions here in Lebanon, as we're seeing thousands of people on the move. The residents of the Sunni and Christian areas where some of them are seeking refuge are now worried that the Israeli airstrikes that Lebanon's Shia are fleeing will follow them.
And I was about to say to you, so obviously we are hearing of these new evacuation orders in southern Beirut because of Israel sending these evacuation orders. Can you tell us more on that? And also, how are people coping in Lebanon? It's been one attack after the other, and this has been very protracted.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real sense of deja vu here in Lebanon. It's really not so long ago that the last war between Israel and Hezbollah ended with this ceasefire agreement that was made in November of 2024. I mean, when we talk about a ceasefire, we should also importantly note that that ceasefire has been violated by Israel on nearly a daily basis, whether it's airstrikes, drone strikes, or the fact that they still hold and have held 5 locations in southern Lebanon since the end of the previous war. And what we're seeing, of course, is these massive forced displacement orders that people across the south have been receiving. So earlier yesterday, there was one encouraging all residents who live south of the Litani River to leave their homes and vacate the area. And that is in the face of more Israeli invasions of Lebanese territory. We've seen them moving forward, and the fear here, and what we're seeing reported by Israeli officials as well, is the narrative that they need to go in and establish some kind of buffer zone within Lebanon to protect their own residents. And so people here fear, one, with the echoes of previous Israeli invasions, that this is not going to be a temporary measure. And these displacement orders, we're talking about people being forced to flee their homes. Some of them have only just been able to go back to their villages in the south in the last couple of months. And some people's homes are still destroyed and haven't been rebuilt since the last round of fighting. So the overwhelming feeling here is deja vu and foreboding and fatigue.
All right, thank you very much for giving us an overview of what's happening there in Lebanon. Now, there has been an Iranian incursion into Turkey's airspace. The ballistic missile passed through Syria and Iraq before it was intercepted and brought down by NATO air defense systems. The strike caused no damage. Al Jazeera's Sinem Kosyoglu reports from the border between Iran and Turkey.
Here we are at the Kapaköy crossing between Iran and Turkey across Iran's Hoy. This is one of the busiest crossings between the two countries. Today, the crossings have been steady but controlled, as we have been informed that there's a technical failure on the other side of the border, Iranian side, and there are a few hundred people stuck to wait for their paperwork to be finished. We have been speaking to people who have been crossing from Iran to Turkey. Some of them are only Iranian citizens. Some of them also hold other nationalities like European nationalities. The opinion is divided. Some of them believe there might be a regime change in Iran, but most of them blame the United States and the Israeli strikes, saying that they are risking civilian lives in their country.
We were only hearing sounds, but we haven't seen anything in the city. They say military targets are being struck, but we haven't seen it ourselves.
There are intense attacks. They have devastated Iran. I hope Turkey, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia unite and give a strong response to these Jews and Christians. Unfortunately, they've come to our doorstep in the Middle East. Our airspace is in their hands. I am calling on all Muslims, focus on technology and unite. We have no other choice.
When I heard Iranian in a war, and I have to back to my country to help my people and army.
Turkish authorities say there is no abnormality in the numbers of the people crossing from Iran into Turkey. The figures seem to be in parallel with the previous seasonal numbers. But still, they say they prepare themselves to any possible scenario for a possible mass refugee influx from Iranian side into Turkey, taking their experience from the Syrian conflict. But of course, they underline that what's going on in Iran today is different than what happened in Syria. They're drawing attention to this, but they are preparing themselves and also Europe for any possible refugee influx. Sinem Köseoğlu, Al Jazeera, Van Kapıköy crossing by Iran border.
Now, more on the sinking of the Iranian frigate by the US Navy. We reported earlier on in the show. Now, the Sri Lankan Navy responded to distress calls from the sinking vessel, which had 180 personnel on board. The ship IRIS Dina went down about 40 kilometres south of Sri Lanka's coastline. Manal Fernandez reports for us from the port city of Galle.
Ambulances screeched through Galle, Sri Lanka's coastal tourist hub, bringing survivors from the Iranian naval frigate Iris Dina to hospital. 32 sailors were rescued by the Sri Lanka Navy and Air Force after a distress call was received from the frigate around 40 kilometers off the coast.
We saved a group who were floating in the water. After investigation and questioning, it became clear they were a crew belonging to an Iranian vessel, and they needed medical attention.
Rescue crews scoured the waters for survivors, but sources said there were no visible signs of the frigate or debris. Early reports of a torpedo or submarine strike could not be confirmed for several hours, until this.
In fact, yesterday, in the Indian Ocean, and we'll play it on the screen there, an American submarine sunk an Iranian warship that thought it was safe in international waters. Instead, it was sunk by a torpedo.
The frigate and 2 other Iranian ships were returning from the International Fleet Review 2026, a multinational naval gathering attended by 54 countries in Visakhapatnam in India. The United States says this is the first sinking of an enemy ship by torpedo since World War II. Back at the hospital in Galle, the arrival of more than 80 bodies recovered from the water. Nearby facilities were cleared to accommodate the dead. Iran's ambassador to Sri Lanka told Al Jazeera the remains of the sailors will be repatriated. The grim task of dealing with the dead. But for many of those involved in this incident, lots of questions remain to be answered. Mina Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Galle, southern Sri Lanka.
All right, let's speak to Arman Mahmoudian, a research fellow at the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute, joining us live now from Tampa in Florida. Thank you for speaking to us here at Al Jazeera. So we saw there the Iranian Navy vessel struck in a completely different waters to where Iran is. Does that set a precedent moving forward that this could happen anywhere in the world?
Well, first, Sarah, thank you for inviting me. And regarding your question, yes, the initial thought was that the United States would limit its naval and aerial attacks against the Iranian naval assets in the Persian Gulf close by the Strait of the Hormuz and the Oman Sea. But this ship been actually attacked in the Southern Arabian Sea, close to Sri Lanka, much further away from the battlefield or battle zone. Americans have their own justification or explaining. It seems that one of the things that the United States was much more interested is wasn't necessarily clearing the battle zone, but clearing the Iranian naval capability altogether. And if we are looking at the pattern of the U.S. military operation in the last 5 days against Iran, we will notice that there is a pattern and tendency, and that is the United States' constant endeavor and attempt to neutralize all components of Iranian classical army or classical military might. They started it with the Air Force and the anti-air defense forces. The next, and now they are focusing on sea. And from what we can see, and the air bombardment of the big cities, it seems the current target is the internal security apparatus of Iran and IRGC and law enforcement bases in order to paralyze the security and military machine of the country altogether.
So is that moving in a systematic way? Is that the usual that you would see for any warfare, or is this different given the way Iran operates quite differently from other countries in a very complex system, if you like?
This is a good question. And to be frank, this war is quite unique by nature. I mean, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in the previous wars, there was a war that started with the aerial campaign and shortly was followed by the ground forces in order to remove the regime and reinstate a new one. In this war, it is unique because unlike many other aerial campaigns that have been done in past in Bosnia and Herzegovina and other places, there is a goal of regime change somewhere in the agenda. And we haven't seen any record, historically speaking, that the aerial campaigns led to the regime change. The campaigns that led to the regime change always are accompanied by the ground operation. So it seems to me that United States wants to have the aerial aspect of it, wants to have the regime change agenda, but not the ground force operation, which makes it quite unique. And the way that the Iranian also responding to it is very unique. This is a war that started between Iran, United States, and Israel. But the Iranian retaliatory campaign quickly expanded to, let's say, that most of the region. Right now, the entire Middle East, except Syria, Turkey, and Egypt, being targeted by the Iranian attacks or their militias. And this is also an unprecedented level of retaliation or response to a war that invades on one country. Specifically speaking, given the scale and the scope of the third-party countries that had nothing to do with this war at the beginning.
How concerned should other regional countries be that are watching this, perhaps from afar? We have countries like Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries, you know, concerned perhaps that this could come to them.
I think countries like Syria and Turkey should be very much concerned right now. We have, as your report mentioned, there was a missile shutting down recently close by the Turkish airspace. Egypt may be a bit less for now, but Syria and Turkey are going to be much more for two primary reasons. The first reason is that in both countries, there is a presence of the United States military. Iran has shown a tendency to attack U.S. bases or bases that host U.S.-led coalition forces. Both Turkey and Syria have U.S. troops in it. The second is the demographic connection. We do know that a good portion of the Turkish population are Kurds. They are living close by Iranian borders, which across the borders are the Kurds, and Syria too. A Kurdish uprising in Iran can trigger or inspire even further the Kurdish uprising in both Turkey and Syria. So the chances of them being dragged into, in a case that war is prolonged, it is quite notable.
But that's probably because of divisions or sectarian divisions. But when you look at, for example, the attacks that Iran has carried out, even though this is primarily focusing on US assets, it has put, you know, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively at a halt. It has targeted oil and LNG in the GCC. As well as the one of the water reserves here in Qatar. What could stop it from also adding another layer, the Mediterranean Sea, for example, one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, if not the most important?
Well, to be frank, this is a fair point. The Iranian retaliatory campaign, unfortunately, has been beyond military access. They targeted hotels, airports, oil field and gas fields. They shut down the Strait of the Hormuz. I think there is a chance that Iran, in as soon, if it is possible for it, will use the Houthis to disrupt the maritime flow, the maritime navigation in Red Sea, in Bab al-Mandab. Regarding the Mediterranean Sea, Iran may want to do that, but they have a key problem over there, and that is the Mediterranean Sea is much farther away from Iran rather than the Persian Gulf. They need to use longer range drones or missiles. On both of these cases, Iran seems to moving toward a shortage, rather either the projectile itself or the launchers that can be used to launch it toward that target. And I think Iranians were going to be much more cautious to use that limited resources that they have toward the Mediterranean Sea and focus on Israel. They probably would leave that to the Houthis, and Houthis has shown the capability to be able to launch targets beyond the region, local area. As in the past, they targeted Israel and coast of
because
Israel.
It still has loyalties across the region in different areas, as you mentioned, the Houthis there. Arman Mahmoudyan, thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you very much.
You're watching Al Jazeera, and here's a reminder of our top stories this hour. US and Israeli strikes have been hitting cities across Iran, and what you're seeing there on your screen are the latest pictures from northern Tehran. According to the Iranian Health Ministry, US and Israeli attacks across the country have killed more than 900 people since Saturday. Israel has carried out a new wave of strikes across Lebanon, killing at least 75 people and injuring hundreds since Monday. The Israeli army is telling residents in dozens of villages in southern Lebanon to evacuate as it strikes what it calls Hezbollah targets. The group struck Israel on Monday. That's in response to the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The Pentagon has released footage of its submarine torpedoing an Iranian naval vessel in the Indian Ocean. The Sri Lankan Deputy Foreign Minister says at least 87 people were killed, 32 sailors were injured. Turkey has become the latest country to intercept an Iranian missile. A ballistic missile fired from Iran towards the Hatay region was shot down by NATO's air defences in the eastern Mediterranean. The Pentagon says it doesn't anticipate the incident will bring NATO into the war. And the US Senate has rejected a Democratic-led effort to bring an end to US military action in Iran. In a 47 to 53 vote, senators blocked the Iran War Powers Resolution, which would have ended US involvement in the conflict without congressional authorization. Most Republicans voted against the measure, effectively blocking the Senate's first attempt to limit Trump's airstrikes against Iran. Right, well, the conflict has throttled global oil and gas supplies. Cargo vessels are avoiding the Strait of Hormuz after Iran announced its total closure on Monday. And that's caused energy prices to spike, and it's also caused fears of worse to come. On Tuesday, President Trump said the US Navy can escort cargo vessels and provide shipping insurance as companies drop war risk cover. But that hasn't dampened industry fears. Cargo giant Maersk on Wednesday announced a shipping halt to Gulf countries around the strait. And at least 200 vessels are currently stranded in the Arabian Gulf. They're unable to fulfill oil and natural gas shipments. Among the many Asian countries likely to be impacted by the closure of the Hormuz Strait is South Korea. The country imports 20% of its liquid natural gas, and that's through the strait. Earlier, a South Korean legislator claimed that the country only has 9 days' worth of LNG reserves left. Now, let's go to Jack Barton, who joins us from Seoul. So, Jack, what does all of this mean for South Korea? And it's not only South Korean countries, rather, it's also Asian countries that are relying on oil or gas from the Middle East.
That's right. Most of Asia's oil and gas comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Most of that oil and gas that comes through the Strait of Hormuz is destined for Asia, and the big industrial nations in East Asia account for a lion's share of that. Japan depends, varying estimates, between 90 to 95% of Middle East oil and gas. For South Korea, that's more than 70% of oil, more than 20% for gas. And of course, this is for industry here, and then the transport to export those goods. So the economy here is so deeply tied in with oil and gas from the Middle East. And that's why we saw that record fall on the South Korean stock market yesterday, a bigger fall even than after 9/11. A lot of that has been reversed. But even as we speak, President Lee Jae-myung holding an emergency meeting to see how to deal with this situation. He's meeting with officials from the Finance and Economy Ministry as well as the Foreign Ministry. They're talking about penalties for anybody bumping up the price of petrol at the service station at the moment while there are no shortages. And apparently he says that has been going on. He's ordered the release of stockpiles for when there are shortages to ensure that prices remain stable here. And he ordered the acceleration of efforts to diversify oil and gas imports from other countries. So that'll be difficult because so many other countries are trying to do that at the moment. And he also ordered officials to activate the $69 billion financial stabilization method, the financial stabilizer for the stock market here, which has been buffered so much by the prospect of these oil and gas shortages, which would impact the energy sector here. So a lot there, but also ordering officials. He said the police, they're dispatching police to Oman and Dubai in an effort to extract 21,000 Koreans, they estimate, are still in 10 countries. And he said a number of Koreans have been brought out from Iran across a land border into Turkmenistan, but efforts really underway now to try and evacuate all citizens from the region.
Yeah, definitely global efforts there from various countries with many people living in this region. Thanks very much, Jack Barton there. Now, the US has focused many of its attacks on Iran's military assets, while Israel has focused strikes on Iran's leadership. Julie Iger takes a look at some of the critical sites that have been hit.
The US and Israel have launched thousands of strikes targeting more than 100 cities across Iran and hitting crucial government buildings, most notably the Tahrallah headquarters in Tehran. Now, this is a key command center used by the IRGC to quell widespread anti-government protests or any civil unrest. Also, in the capital, Tehran, the Revolutionary Court has been hit, and these satellite images clearly show some of the damage that's been sustained. Now, the Revolutionary Court is important because this is where many political opponents of the establishment have been tried. Another key target has been the office of the Assembly of Experts in the city of Qom. Who are the Assembly of Experts? Well, they're a clerical body made up of 88 members who were chosen by the supreme leader. They now have the crucial job of deciding who comes next. US President Donald Trump has also said that the attacks have almost destroyed Iran's entire navy. Most of those attacks have taken place here, across the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. And again, satellite images have captured some of those strikes. This is an image clearly showing an Iranian vessel that's been hit off the coast of Bandar Abbas. But the strikes aren't isolated to military targets or government buildings. We've also reported attacks in the vicinity of hospitals. In the capital, Tehran, at least 2, and also in the city of Bushehr. But Iran's heritage has also been affected. This is a picture of Golestan Palace, and the images speak for themselves. The 16th century site that's crucial to Iran's royal heritage has been affected.
Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani has held a phone call with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. In a statement, Qatar said the Prime Minister firmly rejected claims by Iran that the missile attacks were directed solely at US interests. The facts on the ground clearly show that the attacks struck civilian and residential areas inside the state of Qatar. He stressed that such attacks reveal no goodwill on Iran's part towards its neighbours. Well, Al Jazeera spoke exclusively to Fatemeh Mohajarani. She's the spokesperson for the Iranian government, and she says her country has delivered devastating blows to the US and Israel, and that it is prepared to defend its sovereignty.
It is war, and in war there is both striking and being struck. Naturally, we have suffered painful blows, particularly due to the martyrdom of the supreme leader, our senior military officials, our people, and our children. At the same time, our armed forces have delivered extremely devastating blows, blows that have truly astonished the American and Zionist enemy. They miscalculated. They made a mistake they should not have made, yet they committed it. I emphasize again that although we have endured serious strikes, we have also inflicted very serious damage on the enemy. And as long as the conclusion by our state determines this course should continue, it will continue.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has told a press conference that Spain had changed its mind on refusing to allow the US to use its naval and air bases for attacks on Iran.
With respect to Spain, I think they heard the president's message yesterday loud and clear. And it's my understanding over the past several hours, they've agreed to cooperate with the U.S. military. And so I know that the U.S. military is coordinating with their counterparts in Spain. But the president expects all of our European allies, of course, to cooperate in this long sought after mission, not just for the United States, but also for Europe. To crush the rogue Iranian regime that, again, not only threatens America, but also threatens our European allies as well.
Well, Spain's foreign minister has dismissed her claims, and its prime minister has doubled down on his criticism of the attacks on Iran. Pedro Sanchez was responding to US President Donald Trump's threats to cut trade with Madrid over its position on the conflict. He's warning the conflict risks playing Russian roulette with the lives of millions. And our correspondent Osama bin Javed spoke to Belgian Foreign Minister Maxime Prévost. He told us about the European position and the importance of de-escalating the conflict.
Well, first of all, I would like to mention that we all have interests in the Middle East regaining stability and security. And tomorrow we will have an important meeting between all the foreign ministers of the European Union with the foreign minister of the Gulf Cooperative Council. So that's really important, being able to discuss with our counterparts of the Gulf region, of Jordan, in order to identify how we can support each other and try to achieve a peace result, a ceasefire as soon as possible. We advocated for desescalation, of course, in order to avoid other new casualties. It creates many, many damages, many people already killed. So I think that the attack launched by the US and Israel, we all know that are not aligned with the standards of international law, but it is true that in the same time, the way Iran responded and is still respond with many attacks against all the neighbors in the region doesn't fit with the international law. I understand why the US and Israel have launched these attacks. Frankly speaking, Iran was not a model student regarding the respect of international law, with a lot of threats against its own population, responding to all manifestations with violence, with torture. We know that they've continued to develop the ballistic program, also the nuclear weapons program. So it was time to say stop to the way Iran was managing its country. And
via unilateral strikes, is that what you're saying?
But by action, because the diplomacy has demonstrated also its limits in this situation. And of course, we are for a long time a long-standing defender of the international law and multilateralism. And it is really important to pay attention to the UN Charter and to desescalate in order to let the diplomacy take the lead again. But at the same point, it was not possible to achieve the result expected. And I think that the aspiration of the Iran's people to have more freedom, more human rights is legitimate. And we need to support this aspiration. Of course, we do not have to choose instead of the people, the future leader. That's something that it is in the hands of the Iran's population itself. But it was time to provide strong support to the population and also to avoid the development of the program related to the nuclear weapons.
The UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer has told Parliament that he is staying focused on British interests amid the current conflict, despite criticism from Donald Trump and from political opponents. Sonia Geiger has more from Westminster.
In a hostile session of Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, Prime Minister Keir Starmer was defending his position, arguing that the UK was taking a defensive role in the conflict in the Middle East. Meanwhile, his political opponent, the leader of the Conservatives, Kemi Badenoch, was arguing that the UK should put itself in more of an offensive role and aligning itself with the US. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, however, said that his focus was the British interest, the British people, and on restraint.
We need to act, therefore, with clarity, with purpose, and with a cool head. The protection of UK nationals is our #1 priority. We're taking action to reduce the threat with planes in the sky in the region, intercepting incoming strikes, deploying more capability to Cyprus, and allowing US planes to use UK bases to take out Iran's capability to strike.
Now, a Royal Navy gunship is supposed to be departing from Portsmouth in southern England to Cyprus. It was originally intending to be going this week, but that has now been delayed to next week. That will have political ramifications, perhaps accusations that the British government wasn't prepared enough for this conflict. However, the Prime Minister is maintaining that the UK is taking a defensive stance to this, but that will be entirely dependent on how events in the Middle East will escalate. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
European Union members are sending military aid to bolster defences in Cyprus, fearing the conflict in the Middle East is spreading. Authorities on the Mediterranean island closed the international airport on Wednesday after a suspected drone neared its airspace. It's the third such incident since Sunday, when an Iranian-made drone caused minor damage at an airbase. But as John Soropoulos reports from Limassol, Cypriots have mixed feelings about the military support.
Two Greek fighter jets take off to intercept a suspected drone heading towards Cypriot airspace. The incident delayed flights into Larnaca International Airport, but hours later, the government denied there was any contact.
There were indications of an object near Lebanese airspace. Two aircraft were dispatched, and they remained operational for quite a while without finding a suspicious object.
The reassurance may not have been needed. Life seemed to continue uninterrupted. Designated shelters like this underground parking lot haven't been prepared to receive evacuees. Businessman Andonis Theodoridis told us, like many people, he has his own basement shelter, and that's where he'd go during an attack. He charters aircraft for a living and says insurance prices haven't gone up, despite increased tension and intercepted drones earlier this week. He says the military assistance is a double-edged sword.
Having those troops or those aircrafts and ships coming over, it gives me a certain degree of security, but at the same time, I'm questioning myself the reason why. The drone wasn't focusing the Cyprus territory. It was the British place, which is the jurisdiction belongs to the UK.
But that's not how Greece appears to see it. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis also sent two frigates to the island, a decision MPs praised on Wednesday. France has promised to send an aircraft carrier and anti-missile systems, while Germany has also pledged support, which means that Greece's actions have triggered an EU response. And that's important because Cyprus isn't a NATO member and relies on its European partners for support. The EU is deciding how its own mutual defence clause would work, independently of NATO, which sees an attack against one member as an attack against all. Defence autonomy may be gaining traction in Europe, especially given President Donald Trump's insistence that European nations need to be able to defend themselves without US help. But many here wish life could just return to normal. John Soropoulos, Al Jazeera, Limassol, Cyprus.
A man protesting the war in Iran has been injured and arrested after being forcibly removed from the US Capitol building. And a warning to our viewers, the following pictures show the moment the protester was injured.
Out! Wants to fight for Israel! His hand! Oh! His hand!
The protester, Brian McGuinness, is a former Marine and Green Party politician. He was dragged out of a congressional hearing on shouting as Capitol Police pulled him from the room. Video recorded at the scene shows officers and Republican Senator Tim Sheehy remove McGuinness. He now faces multiple charges. US President Donald Trump has said he expects the operation in Iran to be over in a matter of weeks. But a look at the history of American invasions shows that all they have ended up dragging on for longer than planned and ultimately failed to meet their policy goals. John Hendren reports from Washington.
The American bombs landing on Iranian soil follow a long history of U.S. intervention abroad. President Donald Trump might have been encouraged by the January success of the mission to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
And they're going to make more money than they've ever made before. We'll help build their country again.
We have to make a judgment as to...
President John Kennedy learned the hard way that interventions can go badly and quickly wrong. as he explained after the failed attempt to overthrow Cuba's government at the Bay of Pigs in 1961.
Victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
The U.S. has intervened in Latin America dozens of times before and after JFK's speech. Since then, more often than not, it wasn't the initial invasion where things went wrong. A lesson learned in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, and more recently in Afghanistan and Iraq, where George W. Bush prematurely declared mission accomplished in 2003, with fighting dragging on for years after. The lesson of U.S. interventions has often been that the power projected by the Pentagon often succeeds in leading to regime change. It's after that that things can get tricky. In recent decades, historian Max Friedman has watched one American president after another fail to learn that lesson.
And the United States has demonstrated time and again that we have the military strength, we have the capacity to smash up states that we don't like or we don't like how they're governed. But then to build a replacement that will be on balance better for the people who live there, for the people in the wider region, that's a rarer case that we don't encounter and we don't seem to have a recipe for.
Those remembered as successes were often the shortest. The U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983, Panama in 1989, and the first Gulf War in Kuwait in 1990.
Aggression is defeated. The war is over.
Put there by... That might explain the time frame set for Iran by President Trump.
We projected 4 to 5 weeks, but we have capability to go far longer than that.
Time and tactics will reveal whether this war keeps to Trump's schedule and meets his goal of regime change. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Right, let's take a look at some of the day's other news stories now, because in Nepal, millions of voters are casting their ballots in the first election since historic protests toppled the government last year. Authorities have tightened security ahead of the vote, deploying thousands of temporary police officers and army troops. A wave of youth-led protests in September ousted the government of KP Sharma Oli, but the former Prime Minister is attempting a political comeback. He'll be on the ballot once again. Let's go to Kathmandu, because that's where Tony Cheng is reporting for us. Tony, what is the significance of this particular vote?
Huge. I think it's happening a couple of years before it was scheduled to, I was going to say in part, but completely because of those violent protests that happened 6 months ago when tens of thousands of young people went out onto the streets of Kathmandu. They were protesting corruption, cronyism, nepotism, and it was a protest that lost control. They burned down parliament, lots of public buildings around the city here and in other cities around Nepal. 2 days later, forcing the Prime Minister, KP Oli, to resign. We've had an interim government since then, but really they've just been trying to keep things going. The polling that started an hour and a half ago, we've seen the polls opening, a very steady flow of people coming in. It is all about getting a new government in place. KP Oli is still on the ballot paper, but I think the feeling is this is an opportunity for change here in Nepal. We've been out on the campaign trail with some of those parties, the traditional ones, the Maoists, the Communists, the Nepali Congress Party. I think very aware that their traditional strengths, i.e. getting out into the countryside, appealing to the more traditional power structures within Nepal, that's all changed. And it has been quite an interesting election campaign. It's really not taking place on the streets anymore. It's very much moved online to social media platforms. And that's where one of the newer parties, the RSP, has really capitalized. They were founded about 4 years ago, and they have as their lead a very charismatic former Kathmandu mayor, but a man who was also a rapper, Balendra Shah. Now, polls here in Kathmandu, here in Nepal, are very tightly controlled. We don't know who's got the edge, but from what we're hearing on the street, this might bring about a big change in Nepali politics.
All right, cheers, Tony Tang. Thank you very much. Afghan authorities say that more than 8,000 people have been forced from their homes following a series of cross-border attacks by Pakistan. Islamabad began launching airstrikes on Kabul and Afghan military positions in several provinces last week. The Pakistani government accuses Kabul of harboring a group called Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and allowing it to stage cross-border attacks. Kabul says 110 civilians have been killed since the fighting began.
Political efforts are ongoing, and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan seeks to resolve the issue through diplomatic channels. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan has held telephone conversations with the foreign ministers of various countries, clearly outlining Afghanistan's position and policy. It has been emphasized that Afghanistan did not initiate the war, but is engaged in a defensive conflict.
The United Nations has welcomed the reopening of the Karim Abu Salam border crossing from Egypt. It's the main gateway for deliveries of fuel and food into Gaza. Israel had closed all entry points to the Strip following its strikes on Iran on Saturday. No Palestinians have been allowed through the crossing, but just over 100 aid trucks entered on Tuesday. However, that's well below the 600 per day agreed as part of October's peace deal.
The Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tells us that Israeli authorities today reopened the Karim Abu Salam crossing for the entry of 500,000 liters of fuel and humanitarian assistance that's arriving through Israel and Egypt, and that is welcomed. As we've said before, approximately 300,000 liters of fuel per day are required to maintain the critical humanitarian operations in Gaza. So it is essential that fuel continues to enter consistently until longer-lasting solutions of supply for Gaza with power are found.
China is holding its most important political meeting of the year. The National People's Congress will set out a roadmap for the world's second-largest economy over the next 5 years. From Beijing, Katrina Yu looks at what's at stake.
The National People's Congress, or NPC, is China's top legislative body. It brings together about 3,000 delegates from all over the country, including provincial officials, military representatives, and business leaders. They meet once a year to approve new laws, budgets, and economic targets, decisions largely shaped beforehand by the Communist Party under President Xi Jinping. These annual meetings help to define China's long-term national goals. In the early 2000s, NPC sessions endorsed policies that accelerated China's integration into the global economy, paving the way for rapid growth and urbanization. More recently, NPCs have locked in goals around carbon emissions and a stronger role for the Communist Party in society. This year's Congress is closely watched because it will set the tone for the 15th five-year plan, which runs from 2026 to 2030. This is a blueprint that guides regional development, industrial policy, and investment. Once approved, government agencies and state-owned companies are expected to align. The private sector also takes notes. Several priorities are already coming into focus. China's leaders are shifting toward what they call high-quality economic growth, moving away from reliance on property and large projects and focusing more on domestic consumption and advanced manufacturing. Innovation, another national priority. Expect more investment in artificial intelligence and robotics. Demographics are also central. With China's population shrinking and aging, the next five-year plan is likely to address childcare support and measures to increase productivity. And across all of this runs a growing emphasis on security, not just national security, but security for supply chains, food, energy, and data. For the rest of the world, this meeting matters because it offers a clear signal of how China plans to manage economic pressure at home, strategic competition abroad, and an uncertain global environment in the years ahead. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
It is 3 o'clock GMT. If you're just joining us, welcome to Al Jazeera's extensive live coverage of the conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. I'm Scott McLean. U.S. and Israeli strikes have been hitting cities across Iran. In the last few hours, a radio and television station in Sanandaj, a Kurdish city in northwestern Iran, was targeted. Iran's health ministry says more than 900 people have been killed since Saturday in the ongoing campaign by U.S. and Israeli forces, toll that continues to rise after 5 days of fighting. Now, Iran has launched another wave of strikes across Israel on Thursday. Israel's military says it's triggered alerts in several areas, including Tel Aviv. At least 11 people have been killed across Israel since the conflict began. Israel carried out more strikes in Beirut's southern suburbs on what it calls Hezbollah targets in violation of a ceasefire. The army had earlier issued an immediate evacuation order for residents in the area. At least 75 people have been killed and nearly 450 others are injured. Israeli forces have also launched a series of airstrikes into southern Lebanon. Earlier, Israel had ordered tens of thousands of residents in dozens of villages there to leave. Hezbollah struck Israel in response to the assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on Saturday. Since the U.S. brokered truce in November 2024, Israel has carried out near-daily strikes in Lebanon aimed at stopping Hezbollah from regrouping. All right, let's go now to Tawhid Asadi, who's with us live from Tehran. So, Tawhid, what are you seeing where you are at this hour?
Well, Iranians are now waking up to the 6 day of the continued strikes by the Americans and Israelis. And here in the capital, starting from midnight, we saw another wave of these strikes. About an hour ago, we heard a really massive sound of multiple blasts in the eastern part of the capital, with the shock wave being clearly felt here at the bureau. And of course, it goes without saying that it was not limited to that. Over the past hours, starting from the evening, also these are the continued strikes across the capital in different parts, targeting different places but the whereabouts of which remains to be seen. Seeing the sort of security policy from the Iranian side that they prefer not to spill the beans about the details of the places being targeted, but still we know that these are happening. We can see the columns and the smell of smoke drifting through the air in the past hours and in the past few days. And it is not limited, as you were mentioning, to the capital in the Kurdish cities of different cities, of course, Sanandaj, Saqqez, Bukan. We also have reports about continued strikes. And of course, this is going across the Iranian territories. The latest reports are saying that more than 150 cities have been the scene of these continued strikes. And on the other hand, we've got the IRGC with different statements, one after another, talking about waves of strikes in retaliation. And the IRGC recently came with 17th, 18th, and 19th waves of these strikes, saying that it is targeting actually the U.S. military bases, Israeli territories, as well as, according to the latest, Ben Gurion Airport and the radar systems. This is the continuation of an escalation that we see as a reality on the ground.
Tawhid, I understand that some 3/4 about is the estimate of people in Tehran have left the city to go elsewhere. Where are they going?
Well, actually, Tehran, for our viewers, province Tehran, which is actually Tehran city and nearby other cities, is housed to a population of roughly 14 million people. And of course, it's hard to talk about moving this huge amount of population outside the city. A considerable proportion of the residents here in the capital have decided to evacuate the city. Those are people who have a chance to have a house or something outside, but still we know that there is also another considerable proportion of the city who is still in the town. They are living with all these concerns, frustrations, and anxieties. And of course, there is something else. It was back in June that the city was targeted, and the area of actually strikes were more or less limited to capital, even though in some other cities we saw strikes. But this time, this is in terms of scope much more broader than what we saw before. So not only the capital, but also many other cities are not safe for Iranians, with all these concerns coming in that regard.
Yeah, and it's not just Iran, of course. We are also monitoring strikes, Israeli strikes being carried out right now in Lebanon. For more on that, we're going to go to Heidi Pett, who's live for us in Beirut. And Heidi, Correct me if I'm wrong, but there are Israeli troops obviously on the ground inside Lebanon. They're a couple kilometers inside the border at most. That is nowhere near Beirut, though. But you have been hearing throughout the night some bursts of gunfire. Can you just explain to our viewers why?
Yeah, of course. So the gunfire that we've been hearing at various points this evening has been coming from Beirut's southern suburbs. And the reason for that is that it's a warning to residents there if people get information about imminent Israeli strikes. And so normally these forced evacuation orders come via an Arabic language spokesperson for the Israeli military, and he posts them on X. And obviously, these strikes, these warnings, they come in the middle of the night. It's nearly 5 a.m. here, but we've been seeing them for the last couple of hours. So the entire population of Lebanon is not sort of glued to X in the middle of the night. So locally, when some people do become aware of these warnings, they start firing in the air throughout the southern suburbs of Beirut to warn people that the Israeli military has issued an imminent threat to their homes and their life. And we've seen that a number of times this evening. There's been 4 quite large airstrikes on the southern suburbs of Beirut in the last couple of hours. Some of those were the subject of pre-warnings, but actually several of them were not. So it's important to note when we talk about these warnings, it's not as though the residents of Lebanon always get one of those. We've also seen strikes this evening near the southern city of Tyre, and unusually a strike as far north as Tripoli, which looks to be a targeted assassination. Local sources in a Palestinian refugee camp there say that a Hamas official was killed.
So speaking of that X account that you mentioned from the Israeli army spokesperson, that spokesperson also gave a 24-hour warning for representatives of Iran to leave the country. There were some questions yesterday about who exactly that was aimed at. The Iranians seem to believe that that is aimed at or a threat against their embassy, and they are threatening that any Israeli embassies in the region would be fair game if that embassy was struck. Have there been any efforts to evacuate that embassy or the area around it?
Not that I'm aware of. And of course, if they had evacuated that embassy, they probably wouldn't be posting about it or making that public information. It's not like whenever the Americans evacuate their embassies in the Middle East, it becomes kind of international news because of what that potentially signifies. But we don't have any confirmed reports of that. The 24-hour deadline that was given for Iranian officials and government representatives to leave the country has since expired. So we don't quite know what will happen. But of course, Human Rights Watch has described these reports of the Israelis saying that they're going to strike Iranians wherever they are, possibly including the consulate, as deeply disturbing and also is signaling intent to commit a war crime.
All right, Heidi, thank you. The war has obviously set the Gulf region on edge as well. Qatar's Interior Ministry has just released a new statement on the security situation in Doha. Axel Zaimovich is monitoring that from right here in the capital. So, Axel, I understand there are some evacuations inside Doha taking place. What do we know?
That's right, Scott. We heard from the Interior Ministry a few hours ago. They put out a statement that I'm going to read right now. And they say, in the framework of maintaining public safety, the Ministry of Interior announces that the relevant authorities are evacuating residents living in the vicinity of the U.S. Embassy as a temporary precautionary measure. Suitable accommodation has been provided for them as part of the necessary preventive measures. They also urge the public to follow official channels for more reliable information. But now, this hour, we're actually hearing from the U.S. Embassy here in Qatar, and they have confirmed that these precautionary evacuations are taking place. But they also say, out of an abundance of caution, please avoid the immediate area of the U.S. Embassy here in Doha. But what's really unclear here is, so we don't know if there's any immediate threat following the recent attacks that we saw in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and similar threats were given in the warnings since the Iran's drones and missiles targeted those premises. But the thing is, Scott, we managed to speak to some of the people. We heard from them that they're living in this area. They told us that the police came in, they moved in, and they told the residents living in this area to leave the premises. And one of the people told us as well that they were instructed to go to a nearby metro station. So That's the latest updates that we have regarding this. And this really comes in the light of the warnings that we got from the U.S. State Department saying that all American citizens should leave the region, given the escalation of attacks in the past couple of days. And they even urged everybody, American citizens, to leave even to neighboring countries if commercial flights are not available.
Okay, so we're going to keep an eye on the situation at the U.S. Embassy here in Doha. We are also keeping a close eye on the situation in Washington and the political repercussions of all of this. Kimberly Halkett is there for us live. So, Kimberly, yesterday we got some new information from the top U.S. general who said that the volume of strikes from Iran had been way down since the first day of the war. 86%, he said, fewer ballistic missiles. Clearly, there's progress being made in degrading Iran's ability to launch strikes. I wonder how this will change the U.S. strategy as we go from here.
Yeah, well, it was yesterday for you. It's still today for me. But what I can tell you is you're right. There was a press conference on Wednesday. And in terms of strategy, the United States is continuing to project success, but at the same time is not revealing just how long this operation will go. What we do know, though, is the military's commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, is making the case that there has been an imminent threat for a very long time, but that it now became urgent. And so he had no choice but to strike, given the fact he said on Wednesday that Iran was 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon that could harm U.S. interests. Now, the U.S. president has offered no evidence of that. And a majority of Americans, by most polls, show they do not support this conflict. That's why, again, on Wednesday at the White House, the U.S. president making the case that there has so far been a successful military operation.
We're doing very well on the war front, to put it mildly, I would say. Somebody said, on a scale of 10, where would you rate it? I said about a 15. And we're going to continue to do well. We have the greatest military in the world by far. And that was a tremendous threat to us for many years. 47 years they've been killing our people and killing people from all over the world. And I think we have great support. And I think if we didn't do it first, they would have done it to Israel and give us a shot if that was possible.
The other argument that the Trump administration has been making is that Iran essentially gave up on peace. In other words, casting blame for the breakdown in diplomacy. The White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt on Wednesday telling reporters that Iran refused to say yes to peace.
Okay, Kimberly, so a majority of the U.S. Senate has backed President Donald Trump's military campaign against Iran. It rejected a Democratic-led effort to bring an end to the country's attacks. Patty Culhane now examines the results from Washington.
As the United States military continues to launch strikes from sea and air all around Iran, as Israel intensifies strikes on Lebanon, and Iran continues to fight back, expanding targets in the region, the U.S. Senate took up a single question: should they order the president to stop? For all but one Democrat, a clear yes.
One thing is crystal clear: America is at war. In his own words, Hegseth said, quote, "We are just getting started." You hear that, America? Pete Hegseth says another war in the Middle East is just getting started.
For all but one Republican, an overwhelming belief the war should continue.
Democrats would rather obstruct President Trump than obliterate Iran's national nuclear program. Let that sink in. That's what the Democrats are trying to do. They want to use the War Powers Act as a partisan battering ram.
The procedural vote to move forward failed.
The motion to discharge is not approved.
On Thursday, it is expected to move to the House for a largely symbolic vote. Under America's constitutional system, when it comes to the use of force, there is just one branch of government that could stop U.S. President Donald Trump. That's the Congress. Now, the U.S. Senate has decided that they are not going to do that. They are not going to step in and stop this ever-expanding war. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera on Capitol Hill.
Okay, so Kimberly, Democrats say that they have not seen, even behind closed doors, really any evidence to suggest that there was an imminent threat to the United States, which is what the Constitution requires to go to war without the approval of Congress. So my question is this the end of the road for this, or could we be seeing this challenged in the courts?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The U.S. president is relying on executive authority right now, but it's only short term, and it's only if there can be made the case that there is an emergency. In other words, that the president has to act in spite of Congress. Now, the U.S. Congress is the one, Patty said in her package, and is absolutely correct, is the only one that can, after debate and a vote, declare war. It's not the president. That's why the Democrats are so angry. They feel that the president has exceeded his authority because he has not shown them any evidence that there has been an emergency that would allow him to use that special carve-out exception. Now, what I can tell you is that the own intelligence that's open source clearly states that Iran was anywhere from 8 years to beyond being close to a nuclear weapon. And that is why this co-equal branch of government is so unhappy. Now, very quickly, one other thing, and we are getting a little wonky, I apologize, but the bottom line in all of this is that Donald Trump could have had that legislation passed that the Congress was using to try and limit the president's authority. He could have vetoed it. The only way Congress could override the president's veto is if 2/3 of the Senate could override that veto. And as we saw from the result of that vote, it wasn't even close to that. So this may all be a different conversation after the November midterm elections. But right now, until then, both the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, and the upper chamber, the U.S. Senate, are controlled by Republicans. And as a result, they've chosen not to limit the president's authority. So his desire to wage war in Iran can continue unabated.
All right, we'll see where this goes. Kimberly, thank you. Well, tensions between the United States and Iran have put the focus back on Tehran's nuclear program and a deal that was meant to stop it from developing nuclear weapons. In 2015, Iran and 6 world powers reached an agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. Iran agreed to scale back its nuclear activities and allow international inspections. In return, international sanctions on Iran were lifted, giving it access to global trade and finance. The agreement, though, began to break down in 2018 when Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from the deal and reimposed all U.S. sanctions on Tehran. Iran then went back to its commitments and began enriching uranium beyond the limits set by the 2015 deal. Efforts to revive the agreement resumed last year with indirect talks between Washington and Tehran, but just before a 6th round of negotiations, as we know, Israel carried out strikes inside Iran targeting military infrastructure and figures linked to the nuclear program. Days later, the United States struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. And in September, the United Nations formally reinstated sanctions on Iran after it was accused of violating the 2015 deal. All right, joining us now from Washington is Alan Ayer. He is a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute and a former senior diplomat on the U.S. negotiating team for that 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal. Alan, thank you so much for being on the program. So you obviously have a lot of experience with this. I wonder, if the JCPOA had remained intact, do you think that there is any chance that Iran would be a nuclear threat today?
Well, it's always a threat. It would have always been a threat in that it had a nuclear program and that it had learned how to enrich uranium, which is the hardest part of making a nuclear weapon. But with the JCPOA, we limited the amount of enrichment they had, the number and the quality of centrifuges they had, and most importantly of all, we massively increased our visibility into their nuclear program with verification measures. So I think if we had stayed in the JCPOA, even though hindsight is always 50-50, we would not be in this horrible situation.
So, Alan, if I can just ask you for a second to be critical of your efforts at that time, I wonder if you could do it all again today, what is the one aspect of that deal that you would change or that you would have pushed harder to get in there?
It's not a question of what we would have changed or pushed harder. The JCPOA was 5 years of negotiations, and you could only get so much. Yes, it was a very imperfect deal with serious limitations. Was it better than nothing? Much better. primarily because, as I said, it gave us verification. If we could have done more, we would have extended it for ad infinitum, for perpetuity. We would have, if we could have banned Iran from enriching on its own soil. But there's two parties to a negotiation, and in a good negotiation, neither side walks away fully satisfied.
So the Omani foreign minister, of course, Oman was helping to negotiate this latest round of negotiations between the United States and Iran, indirect negotiations, of course, had said that Iran had actually agreed not to stockpile enriched uranium material, meaning they would only keep on hand what they actually needed for their immediate domestic civilian purposes. That went further than the JCPOA had gone. And I wonder if you would concede that perhaps the huge presence of U.S. military buildup in the region helped push the Iranians in that direction.
Certainly, the huge presence of the American military forces incentivized the Iranians to try to find a deal. But it's incorrect to say that the Iranians had agreed to do something. They had put it on the table. But as Wendy Sherman, the previous negotiator for the JCPOA, once said, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. So they put ideas on the table, but don't forget, they were also expecting significant sanctions relief, which the U.S. was not willing to give. So it's not the case that two sides were close to a deal. But yes, it is certainly the case Iran wanted to avoid being bombed, and so was very, very motivated to try to find a deal with the United States.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has really made no secret of his disdain for the JCPOA. He lobbied against it at the time. He obviously successfully lobbied President Trump to tear up that agreement when he got in office in his first term. I wonder if you can describe, if you can take us back to that time and just describe for us what the pressures that you guys were feeling at the time domestically in terms of, you know, the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, which we know is so strong. How strong were those pressures at the time, and how did you overcome them?
We didn't feel it at all because those were happening at levels above us. The President Obama decided to get this deal done despite pressure from Benjamin Netanyahu, despite pressure from some of the Gulf countries, despite internal opposition from the Congress. He thought it was vitally important to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. The United States as a government waited far too long to even begin these efforts, because once a nation learns how to enrich, then it's much harder to stop them from building a nuclear weapon. So the U.S. delayed fatally, but once we started, we tried to put serious restrictions on Iran's nuclear program.
So yesterday we heard some details from the White House on what precisely was being discussed with the Iranians. And I just want to tell you about what they said was offered. They said that, so in exchange for sanctions relief, of course, Iran was offered to have a joint nuclear program with the United States. It would include American investment and the Americans providing the nuclear fuel. And obviously, Iran would have to shut down their enrichment facilities. The White House, though, says that Iran rejected all of that. Do you buy that?
Of course they rejected it. The United States has been sanctioning Iran for decades. I mean, Iran's experience after the revolution has been that not just the United States, but the whole international community will not support it, will not provide for it. This is what sanctions are. This is what international sanctions are. So it is no surprise to me whatsoever that if the U.S. says, stop your own indigenous enrichment because we'll give you the uranium you need, given the absolute non-existence of trust on either side in relation to the other, I can see why Iran would be hesitant to accept that deal, especially when it's made indigenous enrichment on Iranian soil a red line that it would not violate.
Was that the biggest pushback that you got in 2015, that Iran just said, look, we've developed this on our own. This is our scientists who have built this from scratch. There's not a chance that we will give this up. Is that the biggest pushback that you had then?
No, because by the time we started negotiations in earnest in 2013, the Obama administration had agreed to allow Iran a small token amount of indigenous enrichment. Now, you can argue they shouldn't have done that. They should have insisted, as the Trump administration has,
no indigenous enrichment whatsoever. But for various reasons, the Obama administration didn't. Instead, they said, okay, we'll allow a certain amount of enrichment with highly enhanced verification in accordance with Iran's responsibilities as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in response, and in also limiting Iran to very primitive centrifuges, the IR-1, and very small amounts of low enriched uranium.
Really quickly before we let you run, Alan, what does a future deal look like? I mean, is there going to be a future deal, assuming that the Iranian government remains in place? Is a universe where zero enrichment is taking place? Is that realistic?
I don't think so. I mean, the only possibility is if Iran surrenders. As long as the current regime is in Iran right now, given recent hostilities and the lack of trust, I find it highly improbable that both sides could return to the negotiating table and make such a deal.
All right, Alan Ayer, we certainly appreciate your time today. Thank you for the insight. All right, we want to tell you about the sinking of an Iranian frigate by the U.S. Navy. The Sri Lankan Navy responded to distress calls from the sinking vessel, which had 180 personnel on board. The ship IRIS Dina went down about 40 kilometers south of Sri Lanka's coastline. Manel Fernandez reports from the port city of Galle.
Ambulances screeched through Galle, Sri Lanka's coastal tourist hub, bringing survivors from the Iranian naval frigate Iris Dina to hospital. 32 sailors were rescued by the Sri Lanka Navy and Air Force after a distress call was received from the frigate around 40 kilometers off the coast.
We saved a group who were floating in the water. After investigation and questioning, it became clear they were a crew belonging to an Iranian vessel, and they needed medical attention.
Rescue crews scoured the waters for survivors, but sources said there were no visible signs of the frigate or debris. Early reports of a torpedo or submarine strike could not be confirmed for several hours. Until this.
In fact, yesterday, in the Indian Ocean, and we'll play it on the screen there, an American submarine sunk an Iranian warship that thought it was safe in international waters. Instead, it was sunk by a torpedo.
The frigate and two other Iranian ships were returning from the International Fleet Review 2026, a multinational naval gathering attended by 54 countries in Vishakhapatnam in India. The United States' enemy ship by torpedo since World War II. Back at the hospital in Galle, the arrival of more than 80 bodies recovered from the water. Nearby facilities were cleared to accommodate the dead. Iran's ambassador to Sri Lanka told Al Jazeera the remains of the sailors will be repatriated.
The grim task of dealing with the dead. But for many of those involved in this incident, lots of questions remain to be answered. Manel Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Galle, southern Sri Lanka.
Well, as Israel strikes Lebanon, thousands are seeking safety in neighboring Syria. But Syria has closed its border crossing with Lebanon after receiving a warning from Israel that it may target it. It remains open for Syrians fleeing Lebanon. Obeda Hitto has more from the border.
On the fourth day of what's quickly turning into a regional conflict between America, Israel, Iran, and several other regional actors, the humanitarian crisis is growing just as quickly. And what you're seeing behind me here is more people arriving, women and children, elderly people here in Syria. We're at the Jdeida-Tiabous border crossing, where Syrian officials say more than 25,000 people have arrived between here and the Jusia border crossing in Homs province over the last 2 days. The influx of refugees continues to grow, especially as the violence in Lebanon intensifies. As we speak, there are ongoing Israeli airstrikes on the southern suburbs of Beirut, as well as in the border areas in southern Lebanon, which is going to cause more waves of refugees to arrive to the country. There are UN agencies here on the ground at the border crossing, as well as the Ministry of Disasters and Emergency Management. ready to provide any kinds of medical services and psychosocial services to these people. Most of the people that we've spoken with have been on the road for a day or two trying to reach the border crossing and actually get into Syrian territory. And officials here say they expect these numbers to continue to grow consistently, especially as the violence intensifies in Lebanon. But they say they're ready to accept anybody who wants to flee and make it to safety here in Syria. Obaid Hito, Al Jazeera, the Syrian-Lebanese border.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. U.S. and Israeli strikes have been hitting cities across Iran. A radio and television station in Sanandaj, a Kurdish city in northwestern Iran, was targeted. Iran's health ministry says more than 900 people have been killed since Saturday. The ongoing campaign by U.S. and Israeli forces, a toll that continues to rise after 5 days of fighting.